Hey everyone, it's your professor, Bruce Olszewski, and so let's do this thing. Today we're going to talk about sustainability. More importantly, how do we get to sustainability? So these other topics that I put in here are circular economy and industrial ecology. Okay, so let's get into it. So one of the questions we got to be asking ourselves is, how do we accommodate economic growth and the environment? How do we do both? So the fundamental issues here is that the population is continuing to grow. It's been growing exponentially. That means that about the doubling rate. We covered that in the very first topic about the environment. We know that as the population grows, industry grows, the economy grows. We know that globalization is expanding. There's not going to be any stopping of globalization. We can slow it down, we can change it, we can influence, but it's not ever going to be stopped. It never has been in the history of humankind. So after we have more population, increased industry, growing economy, more globalization, we also know that there's more consumption, and all of this has been supported with or by global lending institutions, which is what we covered in the previous lecture. So as we have all this growth, we also know we have more pollution because of this expanding population and economy. So where is this growth happening? More in the LDCs than the MDCs, but nonetheless, they're both growing, right? Lesser developed countries, more developed countries. And we know that more consumption means more pollutants. So now that we've pretty much defined what the problem statement is, then we have to get into the questions about now what do we do about it? Will we choose to manage growth, economic growth, and globalization? Are we going to take actions to avoid what we know as would be a tragedy of the commons? Are we going to consider sustainability? And if we are we going to take reasonable actions to get to sustainability, or at least reduce the negative impacts that we're currently creating for the current and future generations? And with this, we understand that it's industry that produces goods and services, so that's where the focus needs to be on. It's not going to be on things like what we choose to do as individuals. You may choose to say no to a straw or to bring a reusable bag, but remember, there is nearly 8 billion of us, and what the actions of one individual does really doesn't amount to much. What it requires is the industries that make things to change how they do things. So, will industry reduce its negative environmental impacts? Will it move to create opportunities? So, let's talk about sustainability then. For some people, it's an imperative for radical change that we need to do a lot, and we need to do a lot fast. For others, they see it as a threat to how they currently do business. That includes industry, right? More importantly, it's industry. We're not talking about retail establishments. We're talking about, more importantly, how products are manufactured, and then their overall use and the environmental impacts of those. We call that the ecological footprint of a product. So some people think that we should have this concept of sustainability somewhat vague, and then just slowly evolve into action. I don't really see this being a very good solution, because there's typically very few people who become aware of a problem, and then others do things to manipulate the media to benefit themselves. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of that kind of thing that's going on now with in the world, social media and that. So that points out the importance of things like who's in government, who makes decisions in business, and that they consider real data. So other people will make a claim that weak definitions is a recipe for small incremental changes, but as I'm saying, that we really got to look at systemic changes. That means the entire supply chains, which we'll get into later in the course. So, and I think there's a lot of sensibility to this. Some people will claim that this whole concept of sustainable growth is an oxymoron because no growth is forever, that the Earth carrying capacity is elastic, meaning it can grow as we learn how to use resources better, but at some point there is a limit to growth. So there was a very famous, well-known paper that was written back in the, I think it was the 1980s or 90s, about the limits to growth, and it was one of the very first papers that, actually it was in the 70s or 80s, and it was really questioning this concept of how much can we continue to grow. There are limits. So, and of course there's always those people who are in between on these things, like should we do something radical or something slower. So what exactly is sustainability? Well, it's really about homeostasis, that humanity's target of human ecosystem equilibrium. More on that in just a bit. So this challenge then to sustainability is, and the pursuit of unlimited economic growth in a let me restate that. The challenge to sustainability is this pursuit of unlimited economic growth in a closed system. In other words, we can't continue to have it, because when we continue to have this unlimited economic growth in a closed system, we are faced with environmental degradation, climate change, overconsumption, and all the pollution that's related to that, continued population growth, overconsumption, waste, and then we live in the closed system. We cannot escape the closed loop system. We have to live in it. So if you make pollution, you live in it, right? If you make resources, you have resources that you can make other things with. So everything that you've ever seen, everything that you've ever purchased, when it is discarded, it will either become a pollutant or a resource. And what we're really, really, really good at is making pollutants. What we're not very good at is making resources out of things that are pollutants. Okay. So there's been this evolving political thought, right? That's kind of building a little bit on reminding you of the previous topic about the World Bank, that the World Bank had expanded to intervene in economic and social policies of the lesser developed countries. And so, there was a beginning of a change with how global financial institutions were operating. There was this concept of what they call neoliberalism. It's as you can see the definition down there at the bottom of your screen. It's this concept that free market trade, deregulation of financial markets, privatization, individualization, and a shift from the state providing provisions. The problem with that is that there's no controls, right, to reduce how all of these things can then take advantage of people, and there's absolutely no consideration given to the environment. So there is this opinion, this conflict of opinions, that promoting globalized economic growth is one versus the accelerating ecological degradation that is now happening on a global scale. So the United Nations then stepped in, saying that they see this need for a balance between the well-being of humans and the well-being of the environment, and that continued economic growth without how do we move to undo, I'm sorry, let me be clear about this. What the United Nations was trying to get us to was to continue economic growth without causing undue environmental harm. They wanted to harmonize prosperity with the ecology. So then, of course, a study had to be done to determine what should be done. And so what did the United Nations do? They authorized what was called the Brundtland Report. So in that report, which was produced in October of '87, it was known as, also it was titled Our Common Future. It's commonly known as the Brundtland Report because that was one of the key authors. They coined the term sustainable development. So what does that mean? Well, it's to meet that goal that I just mentioned. How can we have economic growth without causing damage to the environment? So it's the kind of development then that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. You know, when I read that, I'm always thought about, I always give some thought to the statements I always hear politicians say at the end of their speeches. They always say stuff like, and God bless you and God bless America. Well, if they really meant it, wouldn't they be considering stuff like this, about not taking so much for themselves and providing, and not compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs? So I'm often troubled by these statements I hear political people say. So the United Nations then came up with these two concepts of sustainable development. One was the needs, in particular, like how do we meet the needs of the world's poorest people? And then this other idea that there are limitations, right? And limitations are imposed by the state of technology and social organizations. So as technology improves, like how do we process like plastics, for example, to recycle? If we have better technology to do that, then we make things last longer and we can create less environmental impact. Society's had a great way of transitioning from one technology to another. Another good example of that is that coal plants around the United States have been closing. And why are they closing? Because we have better technology to extract and use natural gas, and natural gas costs much less than coal and actually has much less environmental impact. Now, am I saying that natural gas is the way of the future? No, it's really a transitional fuel to get us to sustainability, meaning using renewable, non-polluting energy resources. So technology is key with this. So the three pillars of sustainable development then are economic growth, environmental protection, and social equality. So how are we going to do this? It's a social challenge, right? Yes, technology will play a role. And when I'm using the word technology, I don't want you to think that I'm only talking about, how we often hear the word technology today. It means the device that you're looking at, your cell phone, computers, electronic stuff. No, we're talking about all types of technology, manufacturing, and processing of goods. So we have to think then about international laws, national laws, urban planning, green building, transportation systems, supply chains, sustainable methods of agriculture. Agriculture, remember, is the #1 reason for the destruction of habitats around the world, and we use much more habitat for raising animals because it's the richer countries, richer people that will eat more meat, and that has more negative environmental impact. So how can we have less impact there? And then there is a role for ethical consumerism. Many of us choose to do that. And it's more of a statement of our personal values than anything else, as I see it. And then we have renewable energy, which I just discussed, other green technologies and others. So there's lots of opportunity for here for all of you, really pretty much no matter what your major is, to have us moving towards sustainability. You can play a role. And remember, the world is basically run by people who have college degrees, and that will be you someday, because you'll get out and you can be an influence maker if you choose to be so. So I encourage you to step up. All right, so here's the problem, right? The linear flow of materials. Linear, straight. So what's missing here is that what would come before manufacturing is the extraction of resources, right? We dig up mountains, we cut down trees, we dam rivers, and we do all that to get materials so that we can then manufacture them. So we manufacture those materials into raw product that can then be used to make other things. So you process trees to make paper, to make cardboard boxes. And then retailers will sell things. Consumers, this is me and you, we buy it and we use it, and then we discard it. And when we discard things, there are some choices, because things can go into the recycling bin or it goes into the trash, right? And for many cities, we also have composting as an option. And then, of course, there's always reuse. But the bottom line is that it's over 2/3 of everything that's produced globally ends up getting wasted. Oh, and who pays for all this? You do, through your government. You're paying taxes and fees to government. So it's kind of weird that, we often, like in the United States, we still provide subsidies to industries to extract resources, and then you pay again to get rid of these things. So it's kind of like having the flu. You've got stuff coming out of both ends of you. In this case, it's your money coming out of both ends. So, and then, like I said, where does most of this stuff go? Into landfills. There is some recycling, but again, about 2/3 of everything globally ends up going into the waste stream, landfills. So this system results in wasting matter, and it wastes energy, and when you waste stuff, you end up with more pollution per unit of widget that we consume. And not only do we create that pollution, there's that loss of habitat and the loss of ecological services, bigger footprints. So how do we deal with this? The concept is known as circular economy, right? So rather than linear, we go to a cycle, right? And who's going to have to be involved? Well, industries and the networks that they're part of, and the supply chains that supply industry with things. Government will play a role, because it's government that determines what they will support. How they'll support it. They create the encouragements and discouragements. And with circular economy, what it does is that it minimizes the use of resource inputs. So there's less mining, fewer trees cut, right? It emphasizes resource use efficiency. And then we integrate cleaner production. So I'm not talking about managing or stepping up the management of emissions. The first step is to have cleaner production. Then you have fewer emissions. And then once you produce those emissions, you want to minimize the creation of those. So there's more controls, or better controls with that. And then finally here, it's all these R's: the reuse, repair, refurbishment, remanufacturing, recycling, all of these things that are emphasized in a circular economy to close open loops, right? All right, so now we will move on to the next slide. So the circular economy, right? 3 levels of action at an individual level for firms, right? Managers, which could be you someday, they work to improve efficiency. They work to reduce the consumption of resources within their industry. And then they would work to reduce the emissions and pollutants. They would work to reuse resources. They could trade a waste material with another industry that could then use that waste material to make a product, right? And they would recycle whatever byproducts that they have. If they're making cardboard boxes and they cut out an area for a handle, or they have to trim the box, they would then use the material that they cut, and it would go right back into the paper manufacturer, who then would make that recycle that material into new boxes, right? New paper. So next would be the reuse and recycling resources within industrial parks. So you'd have, and this would involve urban planning, right? You have urban planners that would encourage industry to locate in a area where they have essentially an eco chain for byproduct exchanges, right? Very cool. There's less transportation, there's more use of the materials, less pollution overall, fewer consumption of energy resources, all these benefits. And then you would integrate all of this production and consumptions in a region. This is good because you create more jobs in that region and you create sustainable jobs. Okay, and then you have municipal systems, right? Things that are managed essentially by local government for the collection, storage, processing, and distribution of things. So like the recyclables that you put outside every day, those things would be collected by local government, which would then go to local industry to manufacture new products and goods. Okay? All right, so the solutions then are moving towards material management, right? Not waste management. You don't manage stuff as waste, you manage it as resources. So waste management is largely pollution reduction or pollution management, and it's costly to ratepayers, and it maintains its industrial waste flow. If you make those that create the problem feel a little bit of pain, they will make less of the problem, right? So then the result is that you have less pollution created in the first place, and there's less cost for people like me and you, right? So we end up solving the problem by not creating a problem, right? You solve the problem of wasted resources and pollutants by not wasting so much. This probably sounds pretty obvious, right? So and so sustainability becomes a management policy for both products and services. And there's different techniques, right? There's this thing called sustainable materials management, which is really an evolutionary term for recycling and waste management, because we don't really see it as waste. We call it resources or materials, and so sustainable means closed loops. And then there's design for the environment, using fewer chemicals, using recycled content things, right? To make to have less environmental impact, making things for designing products so that they could be disassembled. And why would we do that? Because it's easier to recycle them. It's also easier to replace parts, right? And then there's this concept of extended producer responsibility, EPR. And basically what that says is that a manufacturer is responsible for the product. So in other words, if they make it, they must take it, right? They make the product, they take it back. You and I shouldn't have to be paying for managing the stuff that a company made that will ultimately be discarded. And then this concept of industrial ecology, which will be the main focus of the rest of this lecture. So we're looking to close open loops. So you see here something that you saw earlier in the course. This is how an ecosystem works. Everything's connected to everything else. And in it, there's essentially no such thing as waste. There's always the second law of energy, and that's what heat shows over here. Energy always goes from high quality to low quality, but matter can never be created and never be destroyed. All we do is rearrange it. So the idea here is to just copy how ecosystems work, right? So industrial ecology is a process where we copy natural processes. It closes open loops. And open loops, of course, are pollution, which is how we operate now. And when we close loops, when we take open loops and close them like nature does here, we create markets, right? That's the difference, right? In an ecological system, there is no such thing as markets, right? But in the human system, everything revolves around markets. So you have to have markets, and in doing this whole process, we would reduce eco footprints. Okay, so industrial ecology, what it does is that it implements, right? It implements this whole concept that we're talking about. It implements the circular economy. It is the mechanism to achieve this. So it changes our relationship with materials. We go from cradle to grave to cradle, right? Closed loop. So in the industrial process, now we have products that we make from waste. It closes the loop. It uses waste as so-called waste, right, as raw materials. And that's what you see in this diagram here, right? Here's the planet, and you have resources that are extracted. Things are produced, right? You see very little waste that would happen and go back into the environment. Things then go off to consumers. Consumers would then take that product, use it, and then recycle it. And then when they do, it goes into a secondary production, goes back into production here, and then so we see this loop that continues, right? And when we reuse things, things can also then get recycled and then come back, right? Reuse means using the product in the way it was originally intended. Recycling means you take that product and you grind it up or process it somehow, and it could be made into basically anything else. Okay, so now we see all this closed loops because now we're involving the human-made systems of economy, right? Of economics. So you have some articles that you'll be reading about this. Gradle and Allenby defined industrial ecology as the science of sustainability, and it's the study then of the flow of materials and energy, industrial and consumer activities, and it studies the flows of these the effects of the flows of these materials on the environment, and also the influences on economic and political and regulatory and social factors, all about this flow of and their use and the transformation of resources to go from waste into resource, right? So the goals here is to match out inputs and outputs so that we have less environmental impact. And the idea then is we have a goal of having less energy being used and less material being wasted and moving us towards zero waste. So the history of this, right, it was, as you know, the Brundtland Report got a lot of people thinking, and then there was different scientists and policy people, but basically it was the scientist people that got around and started looking at these elements, and then having meetings to discuss how this could work. So it's nice to see industry stepping up. And it begins with this 1989 article that you have, I've made available to you in the course modules, and it was in Scientific American by Frosch and Galapagos. I'm not sure how to pronounce this guy's name. Galopoulos, I guess that's it. So they were arguing for this systems approach, and because that's what we live in. We live in an environmental system, and we have the human-made economic system, and so at some point the economic system has to reflect the realities of the environmental system. So they focused on industrial activities, and then they looked at engineering and management, and then they were studying the materials and energy flows and this fundamental perspective that everything goes somewhere, right? In other words, there's no such thing as a way. And and they were the ones who put out this idea about changing from open loops to closed loops to reduce impacts. And they even came up with an organization, you can look this up if you'd like, the International Society for Industrial Ecology. 42 active member countries in this, and their website's on this slide. So industrial ecology has this potential to drastically reduce negative environmental impacts of industrial processes. And, I haven't mentioned yet, but, it was actually a student who told me about industrial ecology a number of years ago. I hadn't even been aware of it, and I kind of was dismissive at first, but then I realized, oh my God, this is transformational. This is really a great idea. So my thanks to that student, wherever she is. So industrial ecology then assesses these, products and environmental costs that include stuff like extraction, production, distribution, consumption, disposal. All of those things that were part of that linear model that I showed you earlier. And the idea is to morph those processes to better mimic how nature works, right? There's a term for that, biomimicry. It's used in different for different processes, but that's the basic idea, right? So how do we do this, right? You apply this thing called a life cycle analysis, and when you do that, you measure economic costs and environmental costs, and actually you will be doing an assignment on that later in the course. But the LCA is the mechanism by which we can create a measurement, and then when you use that, you determine where you can have the biggest bang for your buck, so to speak. If you identify the biggest problem, then you focus on the biggest problem. So that might be the biggest pollution problem, or it could be your biggest cost. And by doing an LCA, you identify those key problems, and now you can focus on those so you get the maximum benefit, right? Much better than working at minuscule micro changes. So the LCA can really help us focus on the biggest problem and then address those first. So industrial ecology is about a systems approach, and it comes from systems science, which is just what environmental studies is. Environmental studies, and there's very few, I think, that really look into this, is a systems science. That's what it is. And so it really seeks, industrial ecology is seeking to redesign this system of industrialization so it can reduce ecological impacts, right? And keep in mind it's interdisciplinary, meaning that this can cut into, and it does cut into, multiple fields: ecology, engineering, economics, business, politics, public administration, legal things, law, and so there may be a role for you in this. And we know then that we're trying to work towards, with industrial ecology, balancing environmental protection with economic and business viability. It's not anti-business. It's about sustainability, and it's about love and appreciation for generations that will come after us, as well as the current generation. Remember, climate change is here. It's for real, right? And we need to be taking actions on that. And by reducing pollutants of all types and improving the efficient use of resources throughout, we will reduce greenhouse gases and provide for the sustainability of current and future generations. So industrial ecology is this objective, although it's a complex foundation for coordinating the design of public policy. So I hope that some of you will be influential public policy people. I have been to some degree. I've created a recycling hotline and website, and I have I hope to do more, and I do what I can in terms of producing professionals in this field to go out and then make a even bigger difference than what I've been able to do. So 4 principles of industrial ecology. Understanding that it's interrelated, that production should be subject to life cycle analysis, that the natural world is the model of efficiency, and that the finite resources have to be returned to the materials cycle. And there are also 6 dimensions that closing loops, very similar. Closing loops is, we need to do that by using nature as the model, developing management methods between industry and nature, right? You borrow from nature to apply to industry, reducing the number of materials that are used in manufacturing, improving materials and manufacturing processes to promote the efficiencies, right? That saves the company money and it reduces the energy used. And the rest follows about energy use, efficiency, and policy, right? So we're copying many of these concepts from nature. In nature they have there is the environment, And for us, there's markets, right? There's organisms and the in nature, and then in industry, there's companies. In nature, there's natural products, and in industry, there's industrial products. Nature has natural selection. Industry has competition. Nature has ecosystems. We can have eco-industrial parks. Nature has ecological niches. We have market niches in industry. And so you can see these others and get the idea that these things are all similar. And so what we're just trying to do is get our economic system to work like natural systems. Now, regulations are always going to be an issue with this. Sometimes regulations can be counterproductive, and so we need to look at these and how to make regulations work to reduce the problems that we see, and to continue to provide economic opportunity for all. So what this just shows you that we currently have a system that promotes taking industrial waste and managing as waste, but what's lacking is the ability to manage that as a resource, right? So we need a change in regulatory process to help companies transport their waste products for recycling and not just for disposal. So you might work in government, you might be involved in regulations. These are the kind of things you'd be looking at. So, another thing about regulations is that becoming environmentally friendly is viewed by companies as spending a lot of money. And for many of them, it's going to be more economically feasible to dispose of materials as waste rather than recycling it. So there has to be an economically feasible method for companies to adopt industrial ecology. So one way of doing this is through a thing called the eco-industrial parks, right? So this is where you have a group of manufacturing businesses all located in the same geographical region, and they seek to enhance environmental, economic, and social performances through collaboration, right? So this community then gets a collective benefit from all this, and so they so this collaboration includes stuff like green design and cleaner production, pollution prevention, energy efficiency. About intercompany partnering, what that means is that the waste of one resource of one company can be the resource for another. So an example of this is the one that exists in Kalundborg, Denmark. I haven't been there yet. Hopefully I will soon. But this is where companies trade water and energy. One company might be producing a lot of heat in their process, and then that heat is being used in another industry, or in some cases even goes out into the public through systems for home heating and heating public buildings and the like. So there's another term for this, and it's called industrial symbiosis, right? And the result that they've been able to achieve at Kalundborg is that there's been a decrease in air pollution, water pollution, ground pollution, meaning stuff that we throw away, and they've been conserving natural resources like water because they use less of it, and then they're creating new revenues because the waste is now becoming a resource commodity. And it's important to note that none of this was mandated by government. Right? They did this on their own because of savings. So, and these companies, by the way, there's multiple types of industries here: electric power generating plant, an oil refinery, a biotech plant, a plasterboard factory, a sulfuric acid producer, cement producers. There's local agriculture and horticulture, and then heating utilities. And so it kind of looks like this. Here's a diagram of what's happening in Kalundborg. You can see, here's the oil refinery and the plasterboard plant and the agriculture here, and it's it's very uplifting to see this, how this all works. So we need to have economic incentives if this is going to work, right? And the basic idea behind this is that you tax the bad and you encourage the good. And so green taxes are one way to do this, and you put the taxes not on people but on industry, or you give them tax benefits, right, by using resources and closing open loops. So how do you make this work? Well, there has to be government commitment and encouragement, right? Government has to be committed to do it, and then they have to create mechanisms that get industry to move in this direction. And I think they need to clearly look at financial benefits for all that's concerned, as well as environmental benefits. The environmental benefits might be things that they start to put a price on, so that companies can be recognized for this reduction in the tragedy of the commons. So a quick review here. So here's some slides, just kind of quickly go over what industrial ecology is, and shows you the importance of a life cycle analysis. You use the life cycle analysis to identify where you can make the biggest inputs. This just shows you about the cycling of materials and how you use less energy in them. More things about that there's multiple components here. It's not just technology, but society. It requires laws, government action, economics, not just technological improvements. They work together. And then there's goals, right? That has to be clear, and has been. And then here are all the benefits: protection of the environment, better communication between the public and industry amongst itself, generating more revenue, on and on. And the importance of the life cycle assessment, which we'll have a lecture on later. Another slide here. So the lessons that we learned is that design a successful industrial ecology method. That is the method to implement the circular economy, right? And so we need some effort on redesigning environmental regulations, on understanding the economic feasibility for companies. We have to recognize that that has to happen, and we want to facilitate that. Improving communications so that the problem that we're trying to reduce or eliminate is made clear, and that we all work together on this. Developing a model, and that understanding that this will be a new paradigm for government. And then lastly, that what we would be doing here is applying total environmental perspective, something we discussed very early in the course. All right, well, that's it for this topic, and I will see you back when we start talking about eco design strategies. All the best, everyone. Have a good day.